Hey there, it's Luis Marina for LC Design. So today we're going to look at how to make this figure 8 thing made out of an octopus. The first thing we're going to do is make the base shape inside of Cinema4D. Then we're going to send it over to Substance Painter, where we're going to get all the nice little textures, the octopus details. Then we're going to bring it back over to Cinema4D, where we're going to render it inside of Redshift. And just to let you guys know, this is going to be a part 1. Eventually we're going to turn this into a VJ loop that looks something like this. And if you don't happen to have Substance Painter, it's okay. I'll hook you up with the textures so that you can follow along. The link to download is down in the description. So when we get to the Substance Painter part, you can go ahead and just skip right over that. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so for those who don't know me, I'm actually a really big fan of collecting pins. And I specifically like to collect pins that are related to horror movies and also theme parks. So this guy is one of my favorites that I've collected over the years, and I thought looking at it, it would be a really cool 3D model. And so I just tinkering with this idea eventually kind of showed me some pretty cool techniques that I'm about to show you guys. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so inside of Cinema4D, what you want to do is go ahead and create a circle spline. And what we want to do to the circle is twist it so that it makes a figure 8. And the best way to twist something is using a twist deformer. So let's go ahead and drop that guy inside of the inside of the circle, I should say, and go ahead and hit fit to parent. Cool. So right here, once you start twisting it, you'll see that it's kind of giving us the shape. I'm gonna put it at 180 just so that it'll look good later. So as you can tell, it looks right maybe from an angle, but from the side it looks really weird, especially since it looks a little fat. So you have two options here. First option you can do is while you select the circle, you can scale it and then scale it on the Z axis and kind of bring it down, which works, but I would recommend a second option. And that is to create an FFD. So go ahead and hit Shift C to pull up your commander and just type in FFD. And what an FFD is, actually I'm gonna keep it out, is basically a low poly cage that lets you do to control the object. You know, it's really helpful in modeling to make sort of like distort certain areas, and it does it in a very nice sort of, gives it a nice fall off, so you don't have to play around with the points or the polygons. This kind of lets you sort of deform it in a more, what's a balanced way. So to kind of explain what I mean, let's go ahead and make it a little bit bigger so that it encapsulates the entire circle. And over here on the grid points, I think there's a little bit too many, so I'm going to drop it down to 2 on all of the axes. And now you'll have access to the points, which are over here. So this is still not inside of the circle, so let's go ahead and put it in here. And so go ahead and select all of the points. Switch over to scale, and then now you can scale it down and squeeze it, and it gives you that nice figure 8. But the reason I suggested using an FFD as opposed to scaling it normally is that this figure 8 kind of looks very much like an 8. But what we want it to look is to look more of a, have it more of a circular shape. And by what I mean is, if we keep the point selected on the FFD and then scale it on the Y, you'll see that it kind of creates a much nicer sort of like teardrop shape. So let's go ahead and kind of get it to where we like it. And so if you want to see how it looks without the FFD, so if you select the circle, so you can squeeze it in, but it doesn't look right. You can do it on the twist, and that, you know, it's just, it doesn't give you the right look, and it just kind of feels like you're fighting it a little bit. But with the FFD, it'll just give you that option to manipulate however you want. Cool, so we got a pretty good shape now. So let's go ahead and sweep this guy. And the way you do that is by creating yet another circle. This one is going to be our profile. So at this point, let's go ahead and start renaming things. Let's call this profile. And let's call the base spline. Cool. So now what we want to do is pull up your commander and type in sweep. So go ahead and drop in both of these guys into your sweep. You'll get a kind of a weird shape depending on the order. So make sure your profile is on top, and that way it's swept all over the figure 8. While selecting our FFD, let's go ahead and pull it forward a little bit so that it kind of wraps around a little bit nicer. It kind of looks a little bit like a snake, which is pretty cool. Okay, so next thing we want to do is deal with these faceting on the edges here. So as you can tell, these polygons are a little long. They're kind of stretched, and here they're creating these like little steps. So we'll go down here to the base spline, and here in the intermediate points, you want to crank up this number from 8 to something a little bit nicer. I usually try to make here in the middle look like squares, like perfect squares. Cool, I think yeah, 64 should be fine. So now it's a little dense, but I think it'll work really nicely. And more or less, this is the base shape. So at this point, we're going to prepare this so that we can send this over to Substance. And the thing you're going to notice right off the bat, well, actually, the thing you're going to notice if you send this guy into Substance is that the UVs are crazy. And the best way to illustrate that is by creating a material. So let's go ahead and just create just a basic Cinema4D material. I'm switching over to the garage shading so we can see it. And inside of the material, here in color, here in the texture, let's go down all the way to surfaces and select checkerboard. And as you can tell, these guys are very stretched. They are not perfect squares whatsoever. So something you want to do, you can either crank up the tiles V and kind of bring it up, something like that, until it kind of looks a little bit more. And that's essentially what we're going to want to do. Okay, so now that we have everything pretty much set up, let's go ahead and export this entire scene as an OBJ. So go down to your export and select Wavefront OBJ. So go ahead and export this guy out. Okay, so once you have your OBJ created and you have Substance Painter open, go ahead and drag in your OBJ into Substance Painter, and you'll get this option, these import options, I should say. And it'll give you the option to auto unwrap, but let's not do that, because I want to keep it procedural. And the thing inside of Cinema is that, you know, we can pretty much turn that into any shape we want. And if we unwrap it here, it's basically unwrapping the OBJ, and it's not necessarily unwrapping the source file, which is a procedurally generated mesh. So let's go ahead and just not select that. Let's keep everything else the same. And so right off the bat, you'll see that we have our 2D UVs over here in our 3D model. And so, you know how I mentioned earlier that these guys kind of look stretched? Let me put this back to 1. It looks like that. So you'll see that it also looks this way here. And so if we drop any material in here, you'll see right off the bat, it's going to look a little weird. And it looks very stretched. It looks normal over here, but the only way to compensate for that is to squeeze it down. Cool. So let's keep that in mind for later when we export this, because we don't want to export a very stretched out image. We want to kind of export a normal looking image and then inside of Cinema modify it. So let me go ahead and delete this guy. And if you have a subscription to Substance Painter, you also have a subscription to a Substance Source. And in here, there are 2 materials that I would recommend getting. They're inside. All you have to do is look for them. One is called Octopus. It's called Octopus Tentacle Skin. Unfortunately, this guy takes forever to load on my machine. I don't know if it's just my internet, but that's yeah, so eventually when it loads, you'll see that it's an octopus skin. I already have it, so I don't need to download it. The second one I would recommend is Elephant. So you have elephant skin worn and faux leather. Download either one. You can also download whatever you want. I'm just recommending these 2 because that's how I made the original image. Cool. So let's go ahead and find our material. So Octopus. And let's go ahead and create it. Looks a little weird. And if you have that phobia where you don't like small circles kind of packed together, this is kind of one of those things that you might not like. And let's go ahead and create an elephant. And let's go ahead and drop both of those guys in here. Cool. So just for texturing purposes, I am going to do that scaling so that it looks right on our 3D model. Cool. Let's try to get it to where it looks pretty nice, like nice circular shapes here in the middle. Cool. And in the back, you'll see that there's a seam, which becomes a lot more obvious if you do this. And so you can kind of see it. So it was already kind of matched up pretty well. So let's go ahead and just see if I can tweak it. Yeah, honestly, we're probably not going to be back here very much, so I think we're good. So next up, let's pull in our elephant texture. And so you'll see this kind of weird combination of things. This is going to be really important because essentially what's happening is that our normal and our height information are kind of being combined. And so it's very apparent in the normal, but it'll kind of mess you up in the height information because, yeah, you'll see what I mean. So what you want to do is flip these guys so that your octopus is on top and elephant's on the bottom. The reason I say that is because you can deactivate the transferring of like your height and your normal by going here in this little layer, go down to normal, and then here putting it at replace, and that kind of gets rid of it a little bit. And then if you go to height and set that to replace, gets rid of it completely. So you might think to yourself, oh, that's great. But as soon as you create a mask, it just comes back. I don't really know why that is. It's kind of frustrating because I've tried all sorts of different permutations and it just doesn't ever take. So let's go ahead and just flip it and put the elephant on the bottom and the octopus on top. So I'm going to leave everything as is so that I can illustrate this potential pitfall. Okay, so what we want to do is have these guys kind of poking out a little bit, a little bit of extrusion. So that's through your displacement. And the way you do that is by going over here to this little circle. This is like a little ball, and that's your shader settings. So go down here to your displacement and tessellation, and it's set to 0 in the scale. But if you increase it, you'll start to see that it starts to come out. And the problem here is, it looks like it doesn't have enough polygons to do it effectively. So here in your tessellation, you can actually just increase this, and it looks a lot nicer. But as you can see, there's sort of like this weird sort of rippling effect on here. And I haven't really done anything to the material, but if we are to go here into our elephant skin and deactivate it, you see that it's a lot smoother. And that's because the elephant skin has its own height information. And that height information is actually pretty important. We kind of want to keep it so that it gives the backside a really nice looking effect. But we definitely want we want the suckers to be the most clean and the prettiest looking. So the way you do that is similar to what I showed earlier. So we go over here to our height information, we change this to replace, and there you go. So now we can go ahead and create a mask for this guy. Let's do a black mask. And so basically it'll get rid of all of it. And so you have two options. You can either go in here and paint it by hand, which, you can. But here's another option. So over here on your left side with your tools, there's this square. It has like a triangle. And this one basically lets you choose polygons. So if you start dragging, it'll create a rectangular selection. And so here you can kind of limit it to the edges. And I would recommend just revealing 2 columns of these suckers. And as you can see, there's a very clear transition point, especially in the height information. So we kind of want to fix that a little bit because it doesn't look natural. It just looks really ugly. So we have a couple options. You can click on the mask itself. Then here inside of this little button, there's this option for adding a filter. And inside the filter, you can type in blur. As you can see, I already have it up there, but I'll type it up again. And they'll give you 3 options. And so you got normal blur, a directional blur, and a slope. So if you just select a blur and then crank it up, you'll see that it starts blending those edges a little nicer. And yeah, it's still kind of extreme, but if you keep pushing it, you'll start revealing the other suckers. So you kind of want to keep it around here. Cool. So it looks a little extreme, and it is. I'm not going to lie. There are ways to fix this, and the way to do it, the easiest way I should say, is you click on your octopus skin. So there's all these options here for your technical parameters. And so you can come down and find this height range. You can crank this down and it kind of lowers it, sort of like it's kind of squeezing it. Or you can do the position, which will then just bring it down. And so find something that looks good for you. Cool. So before we export this dude, we want to bring this guy back up to its normal size. It looks really strange, but it'll look a lot nicer inside of Cinema. Make sure that here on your UV transformations, make sure you set this guy to 1. Oops. And this guy to 0. And so that way it's a perfect square and it'll tile correctly. Cool. So it should look something like this. Really weird looking. Okay. So now we want to go ahead and export these guys. So select where you want to export it to. And what you'll notice here in the list of exports, there isn't a scattering channel, and we're definitely going to need that because we want the suckers to look very organic, but then the backside to look rough, like elephant skin. So the way you do that is here in your texture set settings, you want to create a scattering channel. And that basically will grab all the scattering information that's given to you by the material. So this guy already has like a lot of scattering information. As you can tell by here, you can control the thickness and all that stuff. And the skin depth, that's actually controlling the scattering. So, and you can actually see it by bringing this guy down and selecting scattering. And so you can see that the areas where the elephant skin is visible, it has no information, but the areas where the suckers are do have a lot of information, and that's going to be very useful for controlling it. So let's go ahead, change it back to material, and let's go ahead and export again. Cool. So they made a couple of changes in this version of Substance Painter. Previous versions, you could just add it and it would just automatically add it to your list of exports. But as you can tell, there is not a scattering channel. So what we want to do, we have two options. We can either adjust this guy or we can adjust the redshift one. And since we're going to be working in redshift, it might make sense to just export out a redshift material. So I'm going to go ahead and just select redshift. And here we're going to go ahead and add our scattering. So unfortunately, you can't just drag it in like that. What you have to do first is select its type of material, or sorry, channel. So if it's black and white, if it has color, you can even like combine channels together using the RGB. But here we're just going to create a gray. And once that guy's created, go ahead and select your scattering and drag it over this GR. And here I give you these two options. Put it in the gray channel. And that's pretty much all you need to do. I would recommend selecting all of these guys and replacing the name. And just change out the emission color to something like scatter. I'm gonna call it scattering. Cool. So now we have all of these things that we need, especially the displace, which is nice. Cool. So now when we go back to settings, we have to make one more change. And so here it's set to PBR metallic roughness. What we want to do is set this guy to redshift. And so now you have it pretty much set up to the correct material and all that good stuff. Last thing you want to do is the texture set is set to 1K in our current resolution. What you want to do is bring this guy up to 4K. And basically it'll give you really nice textures that you can then tile. Go ahead and export these guys, and I'll see you inside of Cinema4D. Okay, so now that we have our textures rendered, we can see them inside of here. And as you can tell, it's kind of a pretty obvious cut. So, you know, obviously I would recommend playing with it more. But if you notice, inside of our height field, there's a really nice, there isn't anything messing with our, with the suckers. Everything is pretty separate, which is nice. Same thing with all the other channels. They have nice little distinguishing features, which is cool. All right, so let's go ahead and create ourselves a redshift material. So go ahead and go to material. Okay, go ahead and drop this guy on here. Cool, so let's go ahead and open this guy, and we'll see our base material. All right, let's bring this guy up. And let's go ahead and drop in all of these guys, except for the metallic. That one is not really useful to us. All right, so now we got all of these guys. I'm going to place all the ones that need an additional node to work down here. And I'm going to leave the color, roughness, and scattering up here because these ones plug directly into the material. So let's go ahead and put that into the diffuse color, roughness into roughness. I'm going to leave scattering out just for right now. And let's go ahead and create those additional nodes, which is bump and displacement. Let's drop those guys in there. Connect your normal map into the bump by selecting input. And then let's go ahead and connect this guy into overall and bump input. So now inside of our displacement, go ahead and drop that into the texture and text map. And this guy doesn't actually go into the material, it actually goes into the output. So go ahead and go over to this blue button and select displacement. Cool. So now you basically have built your material. Let's go ahead and minimize this guy for right now. And as you can see, it looks very much like how we exported it inside of Substance. So similar to what we did with this guy, where we tiled it 5 times, let's go ahead and tile this guy 5 times. And now it looks a little bit better. Cool. And let's go ahead and activate Redshift. Let's go ahead and dock this guy over here. And let's check it out. So as you can tell, there is no displacement happening automatically. That's because you need to create a displacement node by creating a redshift tag. So go here to redshift object, drop it in, and inside of geometry, you want to hit override and activate displacement. You should start seeing something, but most likely not. So I usually just crank these guys up to a high number just so I can see the effect working. Okay, so now that you have your displacement going, you'll notice that they're not really that extruded, the suckers are, especially compared to how they looked inside of Substance. So what you want to do is here inside of your change range, go ahead and start cranking down this new range min. And basically it starts creating a little bit more contrast. And similar to what happened inside of Substance, it doesn't look like there's enough resolution on the mesh, so it kind of gives you like these really ugly little little spikes. So let's go ahead and inside of our redshift object, let's go ahead and activate tessellation. And so right off the bat, it should start looking nicer. And yeah, it looks pretty nice here. And so you can obviously increase it and all that good stuff, but I think it looks pretty good as is right now. Let me actually kind of zoom out. And so yeah, if you're having issues where it's even after you add resolution and the things are kind of looking a little jagged, definitely check if your the transfer mode on your height, it hasn't been changed, because I've noticed in the past that if you leave the height sort of like to combine, you're not going to get this clean of a result. So just double check that. Okay, so now we need to kind of dial in our subsurface scattering. All right. And so you're not really going to get any subsurface scattering unless you have lights. So let's go ahead and drop in some lights. Also, I just realized something. On your tessellation and all that stuff, make sure you turn off this screen space adaptive. Otherwise, your geometry is constantly going to be changing based on the camera angle. So yeah, just leave that there so that it's all even and nice looking. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a light. I like to work with area lights. 90. Okay. So like right away, it starts giving a really creepy vibe, which is really cool. I like things that are scary, so it's right up my alley. Oh, let's go ahead and twist this guy. Okay, 180. Cool. So now we have a little bit nicer look. You got shadows and all that good stuff. I'm gonna change the color temperature. Let's go ahead and go to temperature. I'm gonna crank this guy up so that it's a little bit more blue on the top. And this guy underneath, I'm gonna change it to red. So a little bit warmer. That way it kind of gives it a nice little contrast in colors. Okay. So I have my redshift set up so that it already creates AOVs. So if you don't have AOVs, I would recommend dropping in the ones that you need. In this particular case, I really need subsurface scattering. So let's go ahead and bring in subsurface scattering. And let's go ahead and restart this guy. Cool. So now we got ourselves this nice looking little figure 8 with some creepy looking tentacles. All right, so we need to activate subsurface scattering. So inside of our material, let's go ahead and bring this guy up again. We need to select over here in multi-SSS. And what I do is just crank it up to 100, or I should say 1. And you can see over here that there is subsurface scattering working. And if you change from your view, like instead of beauty and go over to your SSS, you can see how it looks. But now if I rotate, you'll notice that everything is pretty much evenly lit in terms of subsurface scattering. But, you know, we have a very obvious difference between the elephant skin and the octopus, like the suckers and stuff. And those should definitely be a lot more like squishy and like have a light going through it, as opposed to the elephant skin, which is very tough and doesn't allow very much light. So that's why we have this scattering texture. Let's go ahead and drop this guy inside of our subsurface multi-scattering general and put it in the MS amount. And right off the bat, you'll see that all of the scattering is isolated to the suckers, which is pretty much what we want. Cool. All right, so let's get a little closer. And as you can see, there's kind of like a little bit of yellow going through. And maybe you're thinking to yourself, that's actually the light underneath. But in reality, it's this guy. You can give it a bunch of different layers. And the thing that's interesting about octopuses is that they actually have purple skin, purple blood. So, in these extra layers, it might be a good idea to add some purple. So over here, let's go ahead and just introduce some purple in here. And right away, you should start seeing some changes. So instead of a skin color sort of thing in there, it's now purple. And maybe it's better to have it in the second layer and kind of crank that up a little bit, and then maybe making this guy, I don't know, maybe more of a red. So let's bring it over to the red side. And it's important that you use very subtle colors. You can't, if you go too saturated, like I'm just going to crank this guy up, it's just going to look really weird. Maybe you want that, but in my case, I do not want that. I'm going to bring it back to red and just keep it there. And you know, you can also play around with the weight of these guys and kind of blend it however you want. I definitely want to get that purple in there. Cool. And yeah, as far as subsurface scattering, that's kind of all I really want to do to this guy. let's go ahead and switch over to our beauty, which honestly is not going to look too different from our subsurface, but now we can actually see the elephant skin. All right. So yeah, we're making pretty good progress. The thing that we want to play around with is, if you look at the original, it's a little bit more rotated. This one is, ours is actually pointing at us, but there's no rotation in the texture. So it's a very simple way to fix that. Here in your sweep, you want to go over here to your object and details, and here you got this rotation. And so then you can start rotating this bit, and it gives it that nice little rotation. You can even make it more extreme by maximizing both sides. So you got that nice little thing. Personally, I don't think it should go that far. I really want to be focusing on the suckers as much as possible. So let's go ahead and keep them here. Okay, so I want to be able to preview this pretty quickly. So I'm going to deactivate the subsurface scattering. The displacement. And the way you can do that by deactivating this guy. Obviously, you can just like deactivate it. There's also another way, which in case you have a bunch of different objects, you can go here into your render settings, and inside of Redshift, go here to your optimizations, and here in global overrides, you can actually deactivate displacement and tessellation. I'm going to leave it on for right now since I am only adjusting one object, but something that you guys might want to know. Okay, so now we want to create like a nice little animation for this. I'm going to change my display mode to constant shading. And so now we're just looking at the diffuse channel. Okay, and so how to animate that sort of twisting that you see in the original? I pretty much just animated this bit right here. Here on the U, you can just pretty much animate it going like this, or whichever direction you want. And it pretty much creates that nice little effect. And so essentially what I did was, this one, my timeline is set automatically to 10 seconds, so I'll go ahead and just create a start and finish. So I'll do 360. Actually, let's change that to 100. All right, so let's go ahead and play it down. You'll see it pick it up and do its thing. It's a little slow, honestly. And also, I'm not a big fan of the speed up and speed down. So I'm just going to go ahead and change these guys to, instead of spline, I'm going to put them to linear. And I'm going to cut this guy in half. I'm going to bring this to 120. So that's right here, 120. And I'm going to change the timeline to 120 as well. So now let's go ahead and play it. It should be a little faster. It's actually still showing as a spline. Let's go ahead and change that to linear. Okay, cool. So now we should have a pretty nice little loop here. And it'll stutter, but that's okay because all you have to do is remove that last frame. So it's 190. And now it loops seamlessly. So we're pretty much good to go when it comes to this particular part of it. I would definitely spend more time lighting it, giving it, this is a little bit a little blown out. So I would just recommend, putting some nice little taste to it. Let's go ahead and play around with one last thing. This is kind of like a bonus bit. You don't actually have to do this part if you don't have Xparticles, but I just want to show you how I did the bubbles. Okay, it's very simple. All you have to do is create a emitter. So I have, I'm going to go ahead with XP system, and in our emitter, I'm going to go ahead and bring this guy down. Let's point him upwards. Let's put him a little lower. And let's expand it. So now it should look like this. It's just pointing upwards. And nothing's really happening because there's no collisions or anything like that. So here in our sweep, let's go ahead and put in XP Collider. And so now you have it'll make it collide. So now when we look at it, you'll see that they start bouncing. Unfortunately, that looks really unrealistic because in water, even when the bubble hits something, it'll go around it. So the way you'll fix that is by creating a gravity in here. Gravity. Cool. I'm going to just drop this inside of the modifier. And right away it's going to fall down. But if we flip our gravity over so that it points upwards, oops. Cool. It'll then start going. But now it kind of looks like rain. And that's not very realistic. So the thing you want to do is kind of crank down the gravity. So I'm going to do it to like, I'm going to divide it by 25 so that I get a quarter of its power. Okay, so now it's going, and as it bounces, it's still kind of, it's going upwards, but it's still unrealistic. It's not looking correct. Now let's go ahead and create an attractor. All right, let's drop that guy in here as well. And so now you'll see that a lot of these guys are just going to go straight to the middle, and they're just going to stay there. But if you push this guy up here, and instead of having it be a velocity, change it to a force, you'll get something that looks a little bit more realistic. So these guys are still kind of going that way. So if you increase your force, kind of have to find a nice little balance here. Okay, so yeah, basically keep playing around with this until you get it looking however you want. It's probably a good idea to just tone it down just a tiny bit so that these guys aren't going in too much, but also you don't want to be emitting so many. So let's go ahead and bring this down from 1000 to maybe like 100. And so now you see these little bubbles. And so that they don't look so much like they're going inwards, you can also add a turbulence to this. Speed turbulence, and let's go ahead and drop that guy in here. Let's increase the power of it. So now it's kind of going that. But if you deactivate the y-axis, it'll only move left and right, or kind of like in a ring. So now you have a little bit more of an organic shape going on. Definitely play around with the strength. Maybe like a 20 is a little bit better. Cool. Nice. So all you have to do now is texture this guy. So here on your emitter, go ahead and create a redshift object, or you can go ahead and drag the existing one and place it on there. And since it doesn't have any geometry, you don't have to worry about it, displacing the particles. But here in your particle setting, you can change this to optimize spheres. And if we press play on this guy, we can then start seeing them. Actually, let me pause it again and play. Let's kind of get it a little bit further along. Cool. So now we can see them. And, they look like little green dots. And that's not the best look. So let's go ahead and change that to something like a water. So create a new material. And here in material, you have these presets. And yeah, there's a one for water. And so you should be able to see it here. And basically, it'll just reflect things. So if you have more lights in here, more things to reflect. So something I've noticed is that instead of having it being like a normal object, which would essentially look like a marble, you can change it to thin-walled. And this one will look a little bit more realistic. It's going to take a little bit for this to the render to kind of like look correct. But while that's kind of doing that thing, we still need to play a little bit more with our emitter. So in our emission, we have this radius option here. And so it's set to 3, but let's go ahead and add some variation to that. Also in our speed, let's go ahead and add some variation to that as well. Let's do something like 40. It's always a good idea to kind of just not use like whole numbers, just kind of something a little bit random. It'll play nicer with the math, I guess, and it won't look so mechanical. Okay, so now some are going a little faster and slower, but since we can't really see it as dots, we have to change our display type. Let's go ahead and change this guy to circles. Now let's do filled so that we can actually see it. And so now, as you can see, these guys have very much varying shapes. So you got small, you got big, all that good stuff. So let's go ahead and play it a little bit longer. And right there is good. Okay, so now when you bring it up, you have a little bit more variation, and it just looks a little bit more realistic. Okay, and one thing you might be noticing is that there aren't any particles on screen, then they appear, and then they cut out and start over. So something you can try doing so that you don't have to render so much, you can basically give yourself a negative frame rate. So if you put negative 100, go over here and go ahead and play the simulation. By the time this guy hits 100, basically everything past that point is going to be rendered. And from there, if you were to render it from 0, it would start from here. And so if you wanted to kind of create like a more looping motion, you can. You basically just have to time it so that there's like a lot of particles already on screen, and then you can kind of time it so that they sort of fade into each other. But also, I just realized something. If you notice, there's all sorts of particles up here just kind of hovering around. So we need to create a kill box. Sounds really scary, but it's not. All we have to do is create an XB kill. Let's go ahead and drop it in our modifiers. And let's go ahead and bring this guy up. I try to bring it out just outside the FOV of the camera. Let's go ahead and switch back. And automatically it's set to outside bounds. Let's go ahead and put it in inside bounds. So now when we watch it, anytime they go inside that box, they basically disappear. And that is very helpful because it'll keep your simulations going a lot quicker. You're not simulating a bunch of random particles that serve no purpose. Cool. So yeah, that's basically the basics of rendering the particles or making the particles. Make sure you cache these guys out. Okay, so yeah, we're basically in a really good spot now. So let's go ahead and activate our Redshift viewer. Let's change our thing to include the tessellation. So we got this nice little looking tentacle thing. Let's also play around with the lighting a little bit. I'm gonna just kind of bring this guy down just a little. Same thing with the other one. I don't want there to be any hotspots that turn white, so I'm just gonna play with these. And let's see what else we can do. Let's go ahead and bring this guy up. I'm control dragging, which will make a copy. And let's go ahead and bring this guy over to 90. Let's pull this guy off to the side. And what I like to do is kind of play around by moving it back and forth and seeing what kind of shadows, what kind of lights it produces. So it looks pretty cool. It kind of gives it a nice little rim light here. So let's go ahead and kind of crank that guy a little bit up. So now you got this nice little shape. So let's go ahead and duplicate this guy again. Let's rotate it to 180. So yeah, you have this nice little counter light. Let's go ahead and change the temperature to something colder. Yeah, so we have a little bit more of like the cinematic look where, you know, you have teal and orange kind of competing with each other. But yeah, once you get in here, you can see these really cool details. Like the octopus skin looks really organic and like slimy, but then it's contrasted nicely with this elephant skin, which is really rough. And so it kind of fits the look of, you know, like an alien. And also when you look at the bubbles, you know, they look like bubbles because they have a very thin shell as opposed to being like marbles, which would have a lot more refraction going on. And also the more lights you add, the more you reveal these bubbles. Cool. One last thing when it comes to AOVs, I want to discuss this real fast because it's very important, especially if you're going to create a looping animation with this. The particles themselves, they will render, you can render the glass, but you want to be able to mask these guys out. And a very easy way to do that is here in your AOV settings, go here to your Show AOV Manager and go ahead and put in a puzzle map. And so it defaults to Material ID, which I really enjoy. And what I do is I just type in a number for each one. So let's do 1, 2, and 3. Cool. If you put 0, it doesn't actually work for some reason. All right, so now what you want to do is on your materials, go here to output and assign one of those numbers to it. So you got the octopus skin, I'm going to put that as 1, and the glass, I'm going to put it as 2. So now if I hit render, you have to make sure this is on bucket mode, otherwise it won't work. So let it do its thing, and if you activate your puzzle mat, you will see it creates a black and green, and if you have a third material that you assign to your third channel, it'll appear blue. And what's really nice about this is that in After Effects, you can use a setting called Set Matte, and you can extract the green or the red, whatever color, and it'll actually create a mask. So you can then use your alpha matte to isolate those objects. And using that technique, you can then place those inside of a pre-comp, which then can loop on itself. And I think that's a really good way to combine all of your different passes and give those bubbles a very natural look. And that's it. Hopefully this tutorial was helpful to you. Make sure you stick around for part 2 when we turn this guy into a VJ loop. The original render was actually taken from my Instagram. If you're into that sort of thing, feel free to give me a follow. I'm under LC Miranda Design. If there's any render on there that you like and would like to see it turned into a tutorial, let me know. I'm more than happy to help. Alright, catch you guys on part 2. That should be coming in a couple of days. Alright, see you later.